Good morning, everybody. I think we're going to get started. We're a few minutes late because people are getting food at Doctor's Day, which is nice. So, since most of us are doctors in training, probably a few, but happy Doctor's Day to everybody. I'm Dr. Casey, the chair of the psychiatry department. For those of you who may not know me, we have a very honored, esteemed guest speaker today, Dr. Benjamin Rigger. Dr. Rigger is a graduate with a Bachelor of Science from the College of Public Health from the University of the Philippines, Doctor of Medicine from the University of the Far East, and more recently, an honorary Doctor of Laws, LLD degree from the University of the Philippines. So a very esteemed curriculum vitae. Served an internship at I'm going to get this wrong, UER-MMMC and affiliated hospitals in 1962, a public health postdoctoral fellow in molecular pharmacology and cellular physiology at UK from 1963 to 65, was a resident in anesthesiology also at UK, and later became the youngest department chair of anesthesiology in the United States at age 33, and also one of the longest serving chairs of a department, serving at U of L here for 20 years or more. And he's an outstanding academician, outstanding lecturer, and has developed a particular interest in the topic of bioethics. And so today, his topic is going to be clinical bioethics and pain management for the new millennium. So welcome, Dr. Rigger.
Good afternoon. I see a lot of friends in the audience, especially Dr. Lippman. I've worked with him for quite some time. If you'd like to make this interactive, just interrupt me anytime, because I don't want to deliver a formal lecture, because you're all friends. So don't hesitate to ask questions. The other thing is that we even wrote a paper together, Steve. Thank you very much. Yeah. This is my really 60th year in academic medicine. I retired about 4 years ago. But it was an honor and a privilege for me when I was a rotating intern at the University of Kentucky when I joined the rounds of Dr. Edmund Pellegrino. Dr. Pellegrino is the founding chair of medicine at the University of Kentucky. He was also an outstanding clinician, aside from being an outstanding ethicist. I just want to digress a little bit before I start my lecture. I served as chair for 40 years in 3 medical schools, and I just want to digress and tell you 3 incidents that I'll never forget as long as I'm alive. When I was chair at the University of Texas in Houston, I took calls at night. And 1 o'clock in the evening, I was called by the resident who was on call, and he said, Dr. Rigger, I cannot start my case because I cannot find my attending. Well, I told him, if you can delay the case a little bit, I'll be there, I'll help you. So I went to the hospital, and when I arrived in the hospital, they were wheeling a gurney towards the emergency room, and that was my entrance because they closed all the doors of the hospital at Herman in the evening. And so when they wheeled the wheelchair, that was my attending who overdosed himself with Demerol, and they discovered his body in the cold room. And I had to intubate him. When I intubated him, I know he was dead because he didn't even react. That is one of the incidents I just want to tell you. Let me digress a little bit more. Here in Louisville, I've trained so many residents here since I'm chair for almost 20 years. And I was waiting in my office one time, and there was my secretary, her name is Carol, poor lady, a tremendous secretary who has a tremendous Southern accent. She's from Mount Washington. And Carol said, Dr. Rieger, there's a young man in here in his business suit. He wants to talk to you. So that is during the beeper system, and they call you to the beeper. I work in the operating room every day. And I went to my office, and I met this young man. He was my former resident. He worked at Jewish Hospital. And I said, what can I do for you? How's your dad? His dad was a urologist. And I said, he said, Dr. Rieger, I came in here because I'm applying for a job. Yeah, but I thought you had a job across the street. Yeah, but you see, I had to leave because I am on an aftercare. So here is an anesthesiologist applying for a job to come back to work in anesthesia. And let me ask the young residents, if I hired this doctor, what do you think are the chances that he is going to relapse? Or what is the percent recidivism among anesthesiologists if they go back to anesthesia? Can somebody make a guess? 20? I'm sorry? No? Very good. About 85%. 85%. That has been known in the literature. So I asked him, that's why I tell medical students, I give this lecture to medical students. I said, how did you get hooked? He said, Dr. Rieger, my wife is about to divorce me, and I was in a lot of stress. I go to the casino once in a while. We're getting broke. I have 3 kids going to college. And so I'm under stress. So I said, what did you do? Well, I decided that I'll get an ampule of fentanyl, and I will break the fentanyl ampule and let it drip down my finger, and I go ahead and snip it. And I snip the fentanyl. And in 30 seconds, he said, I have a buzz. I said, what's the meaning of that? He said, I'm euphoric. And I asked him, is this the first time you did it? He said, yes. So young people, don't even experiment because you're going to get hooked. Remember, fentanyl is about 100 times more potent than morphine. Supentanil is about 1,000 times more potent than morphine. And I asked him, how did you learn this to snort fentanyl? He said, well, we used to, remember here in the University of Louisville, they used to have a wet lab. And he told me that we used to fibrillate dogs in physiology. And in order to resuscitate them, we squirted epinephrine into their endotracheal tube. And they perk up. And he said that I realized that the absorption of any chemical when given into the respiratory mucosa is good as giving it IV. Okay, so young people, if you're interested in your career, please don't experiment, okay? Remember all those years your parents sent you to college, or your spouses, and the sacrifices, and you're going to give it up because of narcotics? Forget it. Let me tell you the last incident. This is very interesting, and it happened here in Louisville. I happened to take call at the trauma center at the University Hospital, and I sleep in the hospital at night. So we were not busy that night, and so I decided that probably I'll go to the restroom. Here at the University Hospital, before you can go to the restroom, you have to pass by the recovery room. When I was passing by the recovery room, it was dark, of course. I can see a laser light on the ceiling bouncing up and down like that. And here at the university, we have what you call a paper trail on what you use in your narcotic. You have what we call a narcotic tally list. That we issue you a narcotic envelope, and in there it has everything. Morphine, Demerol, benzodiazepine, everything, and it's numbered. At the end of the day, after you finish your case, what you do is you write in that sheet of paper what you use for Mrs. Jones, and then you drop it in a steel box in the recovery room, and it has an opening this big. It's about this tall, and so when you drop it, there's no way you can get it back. So that for the last 2 weeks, the chief of pharmacy calls me and said, Dr. Rieger, are you aware that the Department of Anesthesiology is short by 50 ampules of fentanyl? And I said, my God. I said, did you review the tally sheets? Yes. Are they okay? They're okay. But I tell you what, you're missing 50 ampules of fentanyl. I said, oh God. So what I did was I went ahead and stood by the recovery room and see what's going on. And there was my resident, who's so smart. He got a fiber optic bronchoscope from the equipment room, and through that opening, he puts the fiber optic bronchoscope, and with a biopsy forceps, he fishes out those plastic bags and steals the fentanyl. And that is the reason why we're missing 50 ampules of fentanyl. Can you believe that? With somebody with his right mind, he has that mentality of stealing that medicine. And you have to be very intelligent. Remember, our doctors are very smart. That's the reason why you cannot catch them. When they're addicted, they hoard them. That, folks, is my story about that I'll never forget in my 60 years in academic medicine. Let's proceed with the lecture then. I have no I have nothing to disclose. The opinions expressed are my own, not necessarily the university or organized medicine. And here are the educational objectives. We'll discuss the significance of the Nuremberg trial, present the ethical dilemma in pain management and the consequences, briefly explain the principles of clinical bioethics in pain management, explain the responsibilities of everybody in terms of your ethical responsibility in terms of taking care of patients, and ethical responsibility during end-of-life scenario of everybody concerned with patient care. Dubin said, we cannot minister to others in pain unless we acknowledge our own pain. I have had surgeries myself, and I realize how difficult it is to have pain. The problem with pain today is that it is very subjective. If the patient tells you, I'm in pain, what's the meaning of that? So it's still the fifth vital sign, remember? That's what the American Society of Pain Medicine said, that it's still the pain is still the fifth vital sign, aside from blood pressure, respiratory rate, everything. Here's the clinical scenario which you have in your handout. It's let me read it verbatim. 65-year-old white female diagnosed with advanced uterine cancer. Life expectancy is less than 6 months. Cerebral metastasis produced alternate lucid and altered consciousness. Care plan included the multimodal pain therapy and management. Matured son and daughter have opposing decisions. Son wants everything done, including all narcotics and resuscitatory efforts. Daughter wants to limit narcotics and requests DNR order in the patient's chart. Any statement from the resident or attendings or anything about this case? Do we have an ethical dilemma here? You know, it's interesting. If you attend some of the courses of Dr. Dupas, the case scenario that Dr. Dupas uses when he teaches your clinical bioethics is is everybody familiar with the Mr. Dux case? No? Okay. If you have time, go to the web and look for the Dux Howard case, which was a Vietnam veteran who was an accomplished pilot in Vietnam. His name is Dux. He is from Dallas, Texas. He came back home and he worked with his dad in the oil fields in Texas, and he got burned. Almost 100% of his body got burned. The reason why the Dux is very interesting is that there are so many ethical dilemmas in the Dux case. And television show will really tell you how this guy survived being put on those bats. They debrided him, and he was having pain, and he wanted to die. And he told people in the burn unit, both in Galveston and also in Houston, that they should let him go. You know, I cannot tolerate this anymore. There's so much pain. But you know what? The Doc's case, the doctor did not listen to his wishes. They went ahead and treated him, debrided him, and finally, by the way, he was totally blind. But to make the long story short, Doc survived. He even got married. And the controversy in the Doc's case is that at certain stage of his disease, he's lost his autonomy. The doctors did not follow his wishes. They treated him the way you should treat at 100% or 90 to 80% burn. And that is a very painful procedure. If you work with burn patients in the operating room, it is really very sad, you know. But that is the story about the Docs. Okay, so let's talk about this scenario. What is the problem over here? Yes. Very good. Very good. What does the patient want? You know, the children have really no decision in here because the patient can still make an opinion. The patient can make her autonomous decision. And the other problem is the patient still capable and competent? And if the patient becomes incompetent, who is the surrogate? Okay? Of course, towards the end, I'll tell you that the surrogate is the husband. What are the ethical dilemma in this case? Well, of course, the question is answered. As a physician, what will you do? What are the moral and ethical responsibilities for the healthcare professional, the patient, the relatives, hospital, institution, payers, the society, and policymaker? Remember that all those things that I mentioned in here, we have ethical responsibilities. It's only the doctor. It's not only the doctor who's got ethical responsibilities. The hospital, the institution, the caregiver, the relatives have ethical responsibilities. The society has ethical responsibilities. Let's just review the milestones in clinical bioethics. Hippocratic oath, you swear in that every time you graduate that you will do no harm. Medical ethics was, of course, first perceived by Sir Thomas Percival. And then, of course, the British medical ethics that eventually became the references for the AMA Code of Ethics, but that is by Dr. Bell and Hayes in 1847, and the Geneva Declaration, Women's Medical Association, and then the Nuremberg Trial. Let's talk a little bit about the Nuremberg Trial. Because of all the litigations related to medical ethics, the only litigation that had teeth was the Nuremberg Trial. There were two phases of the Nuremberg Trial. One is the Holocaust, which is the killing of millions of Jews, and the other is human experimentation. And you must remember that it was General Delford Taylor who litigated the Nuremberg Trial. And he died about 2 years ago, of course. And what did we learn about the Nuremberg Trial? Well, Helsinki Declaration is, of course, the enforcement of informed consent. But the only really litigation that had teeth was the Nuremberg Trial because people were sent to death. The physicians and the nurses who were working with the patients in order for Adolf Hitler to develop a superior race, they were acquitted. You know why? Because they said we were just following command. We were just following command from the Führer. We were just doing what they asked us to do. And of course, the physicians and the nurses and those who took care of those patients were acquitted. Now, this is, of course, Hippocrates, Sir Percival, This is Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt about the Geneva Convention. But, the Geneva Convention has really no teeth. By history, look at what we did at Abu Ghraib. Look at what we did. I'm a Vietnam veteran, by the way, at My Lai, the My Lai massacre. So as of today, look at the Bataan Death March, the rape of Nanking, where the Japanese tortured those Chinese who saved those American pilots who bombed Tokyo after the Pearl Harbor. And also they raped the women. The atrocities of the Japanese people, including the atrocities of the Japanese soldiers during the great, what you call, Bataan Death March, where they bayoneted soldiers who could not walk anymore. And so that's the reason why the Geneva Convention was really useless. It was really the Nuremberg trial that really did everything in terms of medical ethics. That is General Telford Taylor. And what were the Nuremberg ethics? Voluntary consent, expected beneficial outcome, prior animal experimentation, avoidance of horror, avoidance of risk and disablement, less risk than benefit, of course, proper preparation, of course, scientifically qualified researchers, subjects can retract consent, and obligations to stop the experiment if the results are not reproducible or consistent. Let's review the history of some of the controversies in medical ethics. You, as a student, you're aware of the Tuskegee experiments in Tuskegee, Alabama, where the federal government, the Health and Human Services, funded a research among uneducated Black Americans who were supposed to be treated for syphilis. There was a control and there was an experimental group. And of course, the experimental group, they didn't give them any treatment. What is really unfair about the Tuskegee experiment is that when they were conducting the Tuskegee experiment, penicillin was already available for the treatment of syphilis. And do you know that during the last term of President Clinton, the last few weeks of his presidency, he apologized to the remaining and survival of the Tuskegee experiment. Shana Alexander, they decide who lives and who dies. First time, Shana Alexander is a writer in Seattle, Washington, and it started the rationing of hemodialysis. In London or in England today, if you are 65 and above, they don't dialyze you at all. Dr. Campbell deliberately withheld treatment 43 babies at Yale, New Haven, Connecticut. And these are babies who are probably anencephalic, and they didn't think that they will survive had they allowed them to live. And they were never criticized by any bioethical organization, including the American Academy of Pediatrics. Of course, you are aware of the Quinlan family, withdrawal of medical treatment, where the family wanted to withdraw the respirator, feeding, IVs on Karen Quinlan, but the doctors were hesitant because they were worried they're going to get sued. How about the Terri Schiavo fiasco? When the House of Representatives of the United States get involved in medical ethics, I think that is the peak of stupidity. You know, when the House of Representatives have to vote on the Terri Schiavo case. By the way, you can raise your hands anytime if you have questions, please. Let me not monopolize this. Now, what are some of the adverse statistics? About 75 to 80% of patients have unrelieved post-surgical pain, and that is true as of today. 50% of ICU patients have moderate to severe pain. 40% of dying patients die in horrible pain. Terminally ill patients' pain is inadequate or prolonged. The agony of death, 41% of institutional patients have severe pain. 180 report the first assessment. 14% of nursing home patients have persistent pain. What are some of the ethical dilemmas in pain management? the end-of-life scenarios, act, omission, or commission. It's interesting. I work at the pain clinic both here at the university and at the VA hospital when I was still active. And it's interesting. Some of these patients, they really manipulate you. You have to watch out. And I remember I talked to a patient one time. The first thing he told me is that, "Doctor, I can only take OxyContin." I said, "Wait a minute. You came in here for your prescription, or do you want us to treat your pain?" "No, I can only take OxyContin." You know what I told him? "You're out of here." These are really narcotic-seeking patients. That is really act of commission or omission in narcotic-seeking patients. Animal experimentation, palliative care. How about the non-communicative or the non-cognitive patient, the old, the elderly? The therapeutic use of non-conventional alternative medicine devices. These are the charlatans that will sell you a magnet. It's interesting. I had an attending at the VA who was selling magnets to patients with back pain. And it has never been shown that it really works. Explosive growth of the pill mill or pain clinics in eastern Kentucky. And do you know why? We have a very high incidence of fentanyl addiction here in Louisville, Kentucky. Are you aware of that? They call it carfentanil. It's because of UPS. Most of them are delivered by UPS, and they come from China. And of course, the UPS cannot screen all those packages. And of course, all of a sudden, they're all over the streets in Louisville, Kentucky. Of course, paternalism by the healthcare provider. There are changes in bioethics today because of the managed care era, changing demography of patients. Medicine is now a business. Remember Rob Nader said, if you are not happy with the care you're getting from the doctor, sue the hell out of him. Advances in computers, health expenditure is limited. By the way, are you aware that the healthcare budget is budget neutral? And what is the meaning of that? The meaning of that is that if we're going to do more coronary artery bypass on patients, we might have to decrease the number of babies that are children that we are going to immunize, because there is a limit of the healthcare budget. It is not really a pool that is unlimited. Advances in computers, healthcare expenditure is limited, and of course the emergence of new diseases, Zika, Ebola, sharing of healthcare costs, legal entanglement, litigious society, demand for advanced directives and autonomy. That's very good, because today, I know my wife just had admitted in a hospital, and they were insisting she had an advanced directive. I'm very happy about that. Clinical trials and investigation, manpower crisis in healthcare. I remember when I was chairman at the University of Texas, sometimes we have the 6th floor of the hospital closed because you know why? We don't have enough nurses. HIV and the HIV epidemic. Morality, ethics, bioethics, economics, I would say economics recognize the validity of economic and material constraint. Autonomy, beneficence, do no harm, competence, freedom from disability, sense of well-being, in control of all faculties and thought processes. Do no harm, justice, advanced directives, healthcare surrogates, the patient advocate who enforces the advanced directive. Paternalism, when you impose your own views and values to the patient without even asking the opinion of the patient or asking the patient if he or she agreed. Fiduciary, the person serving as a trustee in respect, confidence, trust, the unscrupulous good faith and candor. Substantive justice, outcome of distribution of scarce resources, who gets what is due. I think it's totally unfair for a patient, for a relative of a patient to tell you, especially because as an anesthesiologist, we are all certified intensivists. When the patient tells you, do everything to take care of my mother, even though they don't have all the resources, that is almost unfair. Principles: respect, autonomy, do no harm. Healthcare providers, everybody has ethical obligations. Patients should respect the autonomy of the healthcare professional, and the healthcare professional should also respect the autonomy of the physician. Patients' rights are justifiably limited when healthcare resources are scarce. Ethical analysis arguments are based on tools of ethics, clear, consistent, coherent, and then the virtue and fiduciary should be self-effacement, integrity, compassion. Patients have different levels or intensity of need and care, universal access to basic and decent minimum of healthcare resources. In other words, that is essentially what EMTALA is. In other words, if the patient is taken to the emergency room, I think you have to do the most you can for the patient regardless of the patient's income, ability to pay. With the scarcity of resources, patients' interest and welfare must prevail. Patients' ethical obligation to be prudent savers for the healthcare costs, I think that's very important. Patient and healthcare professionals have ethical obligation not to impose on family members and other caregivers unreasonable long-term care burden. In a pluralistic society, there is a competing source of morality and multicultural and pluralistic society. This is interesting. When I was chair at the University of Texas, we do obstetrics. And because Dr. Cooley exports patients from Saudi Arabia for their open heart, they usually bring the whole family and they put them in a hotel. And one day, I was called by a male attending at the university hospital saying, Dr. Rieger, we have a patient who is going to deliver a baby, but she's from Saudi Arabia. And she told me that the only person who can give her an anesthetic is a female anesthesiologist. And so I have to scrounge around and look for a female anesthesiologist in the staff who could go to the hospital and give the anesthetic. I think you have to respect those cultural aspects of the practice of medicine. Distribution of scarce resources, limited justice prevails. Here are the ethical responsibilities of the healthcare professional, which are you. Compassion, honesty, integrity, promote patient's interests, maintain your competence and skill. You are a trustee to the patient. Respect the beneficence, autonomy, and self-determination, equitable allocation of scarce resources. How about the patient? The patient should cooperate, expedite informed consent, and care plans. I really hate it when I remember this. Veterans think they have all the rights in the world. I am a veteran, by the way. I'm a retired Navy anesthesiologist. I remember that a patient at the VA one time told me that, doctor, you better take care of my pain because if you don't, I'm going to sue the hell out of you. And you know what I told him? There are other pain clinics here in the city. You go ahead and go to the other pain clinics because I'm not going to deal with you. Respect autonomy of the healthcare provider, not to impose long-term care burden to the family or the caregiver. Right of claim on scarce healthcare resources. Be prudent saver for their our own care. No human experimentation, and of course, refusal to participate if they don't want to be a part of the experiment. How about the healthcare institution? Kentucky One. I was talking to one of the pathologists in the parking lot since I retired, and he told me, he said, how is Kentucky One? I said, Ben, I just want to tell you, it's for the birds. I don't know. I don't work anymore, so I don't know. Okay, what are the responsibilities of the healthcare institution? Financial stability and solvency. Trustee. Professional character and competence of the healthcare professional and the staff. Therefore, the hospital or Kentucky One has the right to tell the chairman of the department that your staff or your residents should be competent. They should comply with contractual obligation and entitlements such as If we have a well baby clinic, we should take care of that. If we have to take care of post-traumatic stress syndrome veterans here in the hospital, we should take care of that. Survival and excellence of the institution. How about the society? Do they have ethical responsibilities? Of course. The society should maintain health and basic needs. They should equal treatment, access, availability, preserve the trusty character of the healthcare professional, appreciate and accept changes in healthcare concepts and technology, ease the burden and decrease possibility of medical litigation is what I'm telling you. Make it easy for us to take care of you. Don't sue the hell out of us. We're trying to help you. Georgetown mantra, this is Dr. Pellegrino, of course, Dr. Tomasma, beneficence, non-malfeasance, do no harm, individual autonomy, and justice. Code of ethics. These are usually, if you work in some of the hospitals are supposed to publish this in front of the hospital, and they should have this. Competent compassion, respect human dignity, honesty with patients, respect for the law and authority, respect for the rights of the patient, confidentiality, apply advanced scientific knowledge, obtain consultation, use the talent of others, the specialist. If you don't think you can handle, please refer the patient to another person who can probably take care of the patient. Provide complete and appropriate patient care without bias. Contribute, here it is, folks. I still go to the third world country once a year, and I serve medical missions, help poor patients. I think that is one of my responsibilities. I was given an award by the Humani Taiwan Award by the Kentucky Medical Association because I do this. I never asked for the award, but I did accept it in one of the doctors' day. Yeah. Contribute activities to improve community, of course, and your civic and philanthropic activity. Bill of Rights, considerate, respectful, fair, complete information given to the patient, including billing. One of the dissatisfaction of patients today, that's why we have some lawsuits. If you survey patients, that number one, the care I received was substandard. Two, the doctor never saw me. Number three, the bill is so high. Number four, when I was home, I never got a call back from the doctor what I am going to do next. All information to give consent, refuse treatment to the extent permissible by the law, privacy concerns, confidentiality, reasonable response for services, very important. I talked to one of my relatives who was confined in one of the hospitals in California, and she said that I was squeezing the trigger so that nurses will come and see me. Nobody showed up. Relationship with other healthcare educational entities, human experimentation. This is interesting. There is now a project that's called the surgical home. And the purpose of the surgical home is to decrease the readmission of patients after surgery, and not only that, to shorten their in-hospital stay after an outpatient surgery. There is something that happened in the Kaiser Permanente group in California. Kaiser Permanente made a rule that in a normal delivery, uncomplicated pregnancy, the patient should be discharged from the hospital within 24 hours. Guess what happened? They discharged a patient, and the patient died of postpartum bleeding at home. Kaiser Permanente was sued by about $3 million. Think about it, folks. Think about it, Answer to the ethical question, which I think I said, were not appointed as surrogates, so they have no decision. If she's competent, her autonomy should be respected. Patients should have agreed to DNR, do not resuscitate. By the way, there's a modification of the DNR. There can be a DNI, which is do not intubate, and there is a DNM, are that do not attach to a mechanical respirator. The patient became comatose. She still feels pain by showing non-cognitive signs of pain. She has advanced directive. Yes, her husband is her surrogate. The husband makes all the decision after consulting with the children and the ethics committee of the hospital. The husband can authorize optimal amounts of narcotic to relieve pain till death. The hospital can sign also, the husband can sign DNR with the consent of it. Principles of therapy and apply. These are last few slides. Stabilize and treat medical condition. If the patient has a pneumonia, treat the pneumonia. Make the patient comfortable. Differentiate new, acute, and chronic or breakthrough pain. Use fewer drugs, avoid polypharmacy, especially the use of benzodiazepines. Start the lowest effective dose, individualize, simplify a regimen, provide perceptual and sensory aid. If the patient cannot hear, give the patient a hearing aid. If the patient speaks a different language, get an interpreter. Prepare patient and family for eventualities. Start with non-invasive, simple treatment. Use the World Health Analgesic Ladder. Does anybody know the World Health Analgesic Ladder? Start first with NSAIDs, and then milder. As the pain progresses, use milder narcotics, and to the time you go to more effective narcotics, including morphine. Use drugs with shorter half-life. Consider additive effects of other drugs, such as tranquilizers. Maximize drug dose, allow enough time. Use consultants and experts when needed. And these are my last two slides. The under-treatment, I'm going to read this verbatim, and suffering and in the dying is unethical. The patient's informed healthcare decision outweighs the clinician's definition of duty, of doing good, creating a moral legal imperative. Lack of knowledge and competence among clinicians who provide pain management to the dying remains a serious barrier to its effectiveness. Lack of competence constitutes professional misconduct, a breach of public trust, and a violation of profession's contract with society. Do you know, are you aware of this, that the American Medical Association said that only 20% of physicians know how to prescribe narcotics? Not only that, it has been shown that in the United States, 6 million prescriptions of narcotics were given by primary care physicians. Only 1 million prescriptions were written by pain specialists. That means that they are a little bit more frugal in terms of prescribing narcotics. Are you aware also that the death from motor vehicular accident, that the death of heroin overdose has exceeded the death from motor vehicular accident? It's four or five times now. My last slide. I'm going to read this. This is a nurse, critical care nurse. We who remain silent while patients suffer, fail on our duty to patients and deprive the organization and colleagues of important information necessary to reduce liability and improve performance. We accelerate our own burnout, hastening the day when we can no longer respond to the emotional needs of others and experience the joy of patient care and the practice of our profession. Thank you very much. You have any questions? Yes, ma'am. I think that To answer your question, I think we should do our best to comply with her request within reasonable limits, as long as it's not a life and death emergency. If it's a life and death emergency, and I guess anybody would have to do the case, whether that's a male or a female, and that should be explained to the family. The reason why we cannot get somebody from home is because you're about to die, and we have to take care of you. Okay? So I think we should I think we should follow the request of the patient within reasonable limits and within the good practice of medicine. Did I answer your question? Thank you. Yes, Dr. Casey.
I had a call yesterday from a physician who practices at the University Hospital who is proposing to create an inpatient pain management program within the hospital. And he was seeking advice about having psychiatrists participate in this program. At this moment, this is an idea. It's not been developed fully. And his comment to me was his belief that we are over-treating pain with narcotics, with opioids, and doing patients a disservice. And he believes that there is a conflict between nursing and physicians in this area. The physicians are responding at times to requests from nursing staff to give more opioids. I don't really know how accurate that statement is, but it's a perception from the senior physician. So I would say that probably everyone here in this room and in general would agree that we should not undertreat pain in people who have terminal conditions. And probably everyone would agree that the patient should have maximal autonomy and should charge them a course in which you respect their wishes. People that have pain needs in a non-terminal condition who may be at risk if they're exposed to opioids to develop ongoing opioid abuse, that's a thornier question and one that doesn't have a very good answer. We do have this idea of pain as a good vital sign. There also has been a lot of thought, and many letters to the editor in JAMA, for instance, suggesting that maybe we should revoke that. Maybe that's not such a good idea. Leads to overuse of opioids. One more comment. I've done a little informal survey in my own practice. My average patient is 83. And people come to me for cognitive disorders, for depression, or some for those kinds of cases, or other problems. And they typically are on a very large number of medications. It's not unusual to see somebody who's on 15 or 20 medications. An amazing number of people walk in my door who have chronic pain, who are on multiple medications, often including oxycodone, and often in combination with benzodiazepine, which in many cases they've been on for many, many years. It would be very difficult. They're not coming to me for advice on this problem. They're coming for some other purpose, but clearly I can't ignore this. And so just within every day or two in my practice, and that's probably everybody here is confronted with these dilemmas and these ethical issues without a clear-cut sense of what's right and wrong to do. So I think our profession is probably in need of developing some, not just respecting the existing rules that we've received from Nuremberg or from Helsinki, but a new consensus on what is the appropriate pain medicine, opioid pain medicine for people like that, particularly people like chronic. And what is the real risk of if you expose somebody who has some non-terminal condition, opioid pain management, that you, for some small percentage of those people, are going to develop an opioid dependence. So that's not really a question, more of a reaction, I would say. I'm curious to know how other people feel, but I don't have a major fear. While the residents work with my geriatrics on it, and they see some similar kinds of dilemmas.
I'm really glad you asked that question. If you look at the CDC guideline for the prescription of narcotics, you will notice that there's a lot of recommendation that we use some of the non-narcotic therapies, which include CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, yoga, exercise therapy. And I just want to let you know, when I was working at the MD Anderson Hospital, we had a pediatric ward of children who were, well, having a lot of cancer pain. And once a week, I observed this, once a week, they will allow visitors or owners of pets to bring their pets to the pediatric cancer ward, and the children can play with the pets. And somebody studied that when the pets are in that unit, the complaint of pain is practically gone. And I think this is a form of a distraction therapy. In other words, the focus of attention of the patient is not in the pain, but on the animal. And I think that is the reason why there's a lot of modalities of therapy that we cannot explain. The only problem, according to the CDC, and I don't know, in that case, if you will bear with me about this, the only problem is that I was informed that the intermediaries, they don't pay for some of these therapies, such as yoga, acupuncture, cognitive behavioral therapy, and so on. Is that true?
I would say that it's much easier, more convenient, and more time effective for physicians to prescribe a pain medicine than it is to go through and try to obtain for a person other modalities that may or may not be affordable or covered by insurance, and that many patients, as you alluded to, evaluate the effectiveness and compassion of their doctor according to the doctor's willingness to prescribe the pain medicine.
Yeah.
So it's a duality. The other thing I would say is that among elderly people, non-narcotic or non-opioid pain medicines are not entirely benign. They have their own potential issues, particularly non-steroidal, which would be potentially also somewhat difficult to read inappropriate things to prescribe. You know, free lunch.
Yes, sir. Ask Dr. Bonica. Let me explain to you a well-conducted RCT. They studied Filipinos who grew up in Hawaii. And then they studied Filipinos who immigrated to the United States. And he studied their response to pain and also the amount of narcotic they need. And it has been shown that the Filipinos who immigrated from the Philippines were more tolerant to pain compared to the Filipinos who were born in Hawaii. And this is well written in one of the pain journals. As a Filipino, I was very interested in reading that there is some cultural aspects to pain management. By the way, I was a pupil of Dr. Bonica in Seattle. He's the father of pain medicine, John Bonica. Thank you. Let me tell you, I had a olecranon bursitis, and Dr. Sai has to take care of the bursa. And there is, in anesthesia, there's such a thing as a preemptive analgesia. That is, you treat the pain before it starts. So I decided to treat myself. You know what I did? Before I went to outpatient surgery, I took 2 tablets of Tylenol that morning. And then after the surgery, I was prescribed 7 days of Tylenol 3. And before I left the hospital, I took 2 more tablets of Tylenol. Guess what? I never took my medicines prescribed to me by the surgeon because I never had pain. But I have 7 days supply of Tylenol 3, which is codeine plus Tylenol. Steve, you have a question?
Well, I agree with everything you said. It's funny, nowadays there's a lot of blame for physicians who started this thing. There's 2 points. One, there were opium wars before there were any prescriptions. When I was in the service, also during the Vietnam War, we had an epidemic of heroin. I remember treating so many of them in the emergency room and other places. So it comes and goes. We have other addictions. We haven't since time began. But the other thing that's interesting to me is that I don't even remember the time, but it must have been about 80-something when the whole medical community said we're undertreating pain, treat pain, treat pain, treat pain, treat pain. But so the doctors are just microcosm of the society. We were demanding more pain treatment, more pain treatment. That's when all these pain centers developed. And then we sort of maybe we shot the needle too far over, and now maybe we're bringing it back. But it's funny how the sociology is also involved.
Can I share with you confidential information? I trained an anesthesiologist whose parents are both psychiatrists. He was paying work here and across the river, and he's now in the 6 years at the federal prison in Ashland because he had 5 overdoses. He upcoded his Medicare thing, and he overprescribed. He was prescribing about 1,000 prescriptions of narcotic every month. I'm ashamed to tell you, I trained him here at U of L, and he is a U of L graduate. What a shame. Yes, Dr. Casey.
I've spoken to many physicians who would echo what Steve said, that physicians are getting a little bit of a rough laugh because we did respond to the pressures that were put on us in the 80s. And those ideas about ideal physician practice have been codified into KCAA code reviews, for instance, physician participation reviews, which provided adequate pain medicine with the idea of pain as a good vital sign, are ways in which physicians really rated. I believe that it's likely that those will be rethought.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're kind of in a low moment. It's not in medicine, and it's not really clear to me what direction things can go, whether it's opioid epidemic will settle down and continue business as usual, or whether there'll be some decay in the way we approach pain. It's unclear to me, but I would bet on the latter. It's interesting that the opioid epidemic that occurred at the end of the Vietnam War was a real eye-opener for American medicine in the country because at that time it was believed that heroin was basically untreated as condition for people that had come back to Vietnam and have this condition for the rest of their lives. It would be a terrible burden on society. Murray Weiss, the very famous social worker, did studies that showed that didn't in fact happen. The great majority of those returning veterans who came to the United States, and they were in totally different social contexts, were able to stop using heroin without any form of treatment. It would suggest that there's a lot that we didn't know, and there's a lot that we still don't know about what's likely to happen.
Well, let me tell you what's in the pipeline. This is good news, by the way, if people can afford it. They now have what you call the ADF, abuse deterrent formulations, where you cannot boil, grind, or monkey with the preparation because the narcotic will not be effective. The problem is that they're very expensive. It's about $1,000 to $2,000, and who among the addicts can afford that? Yes, Steve?
Another historical perspective is to put another thought. In 1936, about Roosevelt, as part of the New Deal, had a Narcotics Act passed by Congress, United States Congress, to combat the heroin epidemic in the 30s, way before Vietnam. And that's when they instituted the Lexington Narcotics Hospital and the Fort Worth Hospital, because it said this is, up until that time, the narcotic addicts were treated, well, they still are today, with segregation and very negatively and badly. That was a big issue in the 30s, and the narcotic hospital in Lexington and Fort Worth, Texas, were the beginning of humane treatment of addiction. They failed miserably at their efforts, but they did start the humane treatment of addiction in the world, really.
When I was a postdoc at UK, they still have the Narco Addiction Center. Very few people know that. Are you aware that the Narcotic Addiction Center was in Lexington, Kentucky? And I had a chance to work with some of their pharmacologists there. It was a good training, by the way. Let me close with this. The opioid epidemic in the Philippines has been so flagrant and rampant. So you know what is the order of the president of the Philippines? His name is President Duterte. Shoot to kill. Any pusher or dealer, the order to the police is shoot to kill. Guess what? The incidence of pushing and distributing narcotic in the Philippines have decreased. I think that's a little bit radical. But if that is the way you're going to solve it, I don't really know. But it works. Thank you, folks. You have a good day.
Happy birthday. That's what it is.